Dr. Aysha Akhtar is a double board certified neurologist and preventive medicine public health specialist. She's president and CEO of the Center for Contemporary Sciences, which works towards replacing unreliable animal testing with more effective human specific research techniques. Dr. Akhtar is a U.S. veteran who served as deputy director of the Traumatic Brain Injury Program and as a commander in the U.S. Public Health Service Commissioned Corps, where she assisted with national public health emergencies. Aysha also served as a medical officer at the Food and Drug Administration, most recently in the Office of Counterterrorism and Emerging Threats, implementing studies on vaccine effectiveness and safety, and using her top secret security clearance to develop national preparedness strategies for public health threats. Dr. Akhtar is published in peer-reviewed journals, including Lancet, Pediatrics, Journal of Public Health Policy, and Reviews in the Neurosciences, and she's author of 2 books, Our Symphony with Animals on Health, Empathy, and Our Shared Destinies, and Animals and Public Health, which argues for the need to include animals as part of the public when we're talking about public health. Thank you so much for taking the time today, Dr. Akhtar.
Thanks so much for having me here, Janine.
Absolutely. I think we could, there's so much. You've done so much in your life already. It's amazing. I'd like to start with when did you become vegan, and how has that impacted some of these other things that you've done in your life?
Sure. So, I didn't grow up vegetarian. My family's from Pakistan, and if you know anything about Islamic culture, is we're not vegetarians culturally. So it was really we had cats. When I was in high school, we had cats as part of our family, and we just absolutely loved those babies. We loved them. They were, our babies. They were our family. And we had never really thought about anything else beyond our cats. I mean, as far as like the animals we eat, until my sister accidentally got it. She was mailing out for some information. She thought it was an environmental organization. And actually what she got was information from PETA. This was the late 80s. And we got information in the mail really about factory farming. And there was one story in particular about what happened to one cow. And it was just so gut-wrenching what this poor cow endured, the suffering, the beating she endured. And we had never once thought about these animals. We never, we couldn't imagine that there was such cruelty that existed in this. And actually, so my mom read it, I read it, my 2 sisters read it. And that evening, my mom came down and said, that's it, I'm no longer serving meat at the dinner table. And the girls all agreed right away. The boys, as was typical, especially at that time, kind of fought for a while, my brother and my dad, but they came on board eventually. So, it was easy for us because we were able to quickly make that connection between cows and our cats. There is ultimately no real difference in either. So we became vegans, vegetarians, and then vegans together, which I'm really grateful. It's wonderful having a family who is supportive and part of this process. And then me as an individual, I started reading everything about the way we treat animals, about all the different industries that involved animal use, basically. I started reading every book out there, Peter Singer's Animal Liberation and everything. And when I read Peter Singer's, so I had that emotional eye-opener when I read The Down Cow. And then when I read Peter Singer's book, I had an intellectual eye-opener because it made sense to me that how we treat animals is so connected with women's rights and civil rights. And, you can just go down the line, that the same type of attitudes, the same kind of pervasive dominance, for whatever, it's one group over another, whether we're talking about men over women, whites over blacks, humans over animals, is that same type of dominant kind of perspective that really is underlying so much of how we treat each other and other animals. And so there's a real connection between those, and it just made sense to me.
Absolutely. And so you've done a lot of work with the U.S. government. So now you're somehow you're in the U.S. now, and you've served in the military and you've served at the FDA. And what do we know about those organizations? And is there a vegan influence in there aside from perhaps the odd individual?
Not so much culturally that I know of. When I was at the Army, I was there for a couple of years, and I'd go and heat up my food in the microwave in the common kitchen areas, and then I would see other soldiers, women and men, who would start talking to me about the food, and turned out many of them were either trying vegan or going or are vegan or predominantly vegan. So it's more of an individual change, but I was obviously very grateful to see that.
For sure. I tend to think that, this othering that we do, that you mentioned, the oppression. In order to do that oppression, we have to create the other. They have to be different from us, I think. And it seems like that's a lot of what military does around the world is we have to other somehow in order to separate ourselves, So it would be wonderful if there could be, I don't know, I hold out hope that as there's more vegans in various places in the world, that we'll start to see that shift. I mean, I've certainly noticed that shift in myself, just in terms of increased empathy towards all others. It seems a natural extension of it.
I think, what obviously that's part of warfare. It's always been part of warfare throughout human existence, since the othering of others to a large degree. And we know a lot of warfare is based on economic issues and, resources, and not sharing resources, or not wanting to share resources, or someone holding close to them the resources that they should be sharing with others, and so on. So, but you're right. I think, it's part of a larger journey for human species to really start thinking differently in how we do think about those that we currently think of other, whether they're other humans or other animals.
And you've talked about how other animals are, as a neurologist, we can look at the brain functioning of other animals and see similarities across species. Is that right?
Yeah, we definitely do see similarities across species, and we also see differences. And this in some ways gets back to my current work. Right now, I'm running a nonprofit organization we just launched a year ago. It's called the Center for Contemporary Sciences, to help move away from animal experimentation and to move into testing methods that are based on human biology. So, you think that makes sense, right? We're trying to find cures for human diseases. We should be studying human biology, not a rat, not a dog or a monkey. Um, but what makes sense isn't always the way people move. So we're trying to push that move at a faster direction. But so yes, there are similarities in how I would say that there are similarities in ways that make moral sense, right? So we see that other animals have the capacities to feel pain, to suffer, to feel loneliness, fear, anxiety, depression. We know mice and rats can feel depression. We know pigs can feel depression. We know they can also, on the other side, feel joy and love. They can feel boredom. They can feel excitement. We all know this. And so in that sense, yes, there's so many similarities. Unfortunately, because of that, that's the excuse often used to justify using animals in experimentation, especially neurological experiments. The problem is that when you're getting to the level of trying to understand the neurological mechanisms that lead to things like that, or can be a causal factor in things like depression in humans, or the onset of Alzheimer's disease, or how brain cancers develop, or just the litany of neurological and mental health issues humans experience. There are distinct differences in the pathways, in how they manifest and what manifests between humans and other species. So it's there's many similarities in our capacities, our emotional capacities, but there are many distinct differences in the biology behind those capacities. And that's why we really need to move away from using animals, because their biology, where we are today in medical research, where we're looking at subtle nuances of molecular biology, we really need the best, most accurate testing methods possible. And there's too many species differences that really justifies the use of animals, even for scientific human health purposes.
It's not even there's not even a degree of accuracy really in terms of medicines that have emerged as a result of animal testing, right? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, and that's what the science is really showing. So whether people care about animals or they just care about them, or they care about themselves and human health, we need to move away from animal testing, because the science is showing that animal testing is not to say this never work, but animal testing as a whole is proving to be very unreliable in predicting what we're going to see in humans, very unreliable in predicting whether drugs and vaccines are going to be safe in humans, and very unreliable in just even telling us what we should expect for how diseases manifest in humans, and the origins of these diseases and so on. So there's a scientific imperative to move away from animal testing for our benefit. If nothing else, for our benefit, we need to move away. We do know that about 90 to 95% of the drugs and vaccines that pass animal tests, that are found safe and effective in animals, end up failing in human trials. They mostly fail because they're found to be unsafe or ineffective in humans. So that's that alone should tell you how ineffective animal testing is. And so that statistic alone is just reason enough to truly just move away. As I keep saying, move away from animal testing. By moving away from animal testing, we actually have a win-win scenario for humans and animals.
I'm guessing that there's a direct link, of course, between the science that goes on and the regulations that governments put in place, and ostensibly to protect us. That there's approvals that have to be had, but even for makeup, apparently, you have to test on animals in some countries in order to get approval to sell the product. And so it seems like that's a big piece of it, that the government, we need to shift things from the government's perspective to accept testing methods, alternative testing methods. And then also there's big pharma that doesn't really want us to get to the root of what is causing these diseases, or to find alternate solutions. Because they're making money off of selling us their solution, which isn't always a solution. So, how does the Center for Contemporary Sciences, is there a relationship between those two big kind of corporate entities? And how much of the work that you're doing is about changing the structure there, and then how much of it is about developing alternative methods?
Sure. So there is one misconception a lot of people have when they think about animal testing. Everyone thinks, pharma and drug development, and often the response we may get from people is no, but the FDA requires animal testing, so you have to do animal testing. Actually, most animal experimentation doesn't have anything to do with drug and vaccine development. Most animal experimentation actually occurs at what we call the basic research level. This is the academic research is happening at academic institutions throughout the world. Researchers get grants from the National Institutes of Health and other entities, and from our medical charities. Bill and Gates, Melinda Foundation has given lots of money to experiment on animals for different things. So there's no requirement for animal experimentation at this level. This is done because this is what the researchers know how to do. This is how NIH prioritizes its grants, is more for animal testing. It's because it's habit. It's because it's an ingrained culture. So there's no regulatory legal requirement whatsoever to do the majority of animal experimentation that occurs not only in the United States, but throughout the world. Now, for the percentage that there are regulatory requirements. We're talking about two main areas. One is for drugs and vaccines, and the other is for chemical testing, toxicity testing, for a risk assessment for chemicals. Now, we know that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, in 2019 made an announcement that it was going to phase out all requirements for testing on mammals by 2035. And that's a huge deal. It's not all animals, it's mammals, but it's a great step in the right direction. And so they know we know we don't need to test on animals. We know that toxicity testing of animals is incredibly unreliable in predicting what the toxicity is going to be in humans. Mice cannot predict rats, rats cannot predict dogs, dogs cannot predict monkeys. So there's so much differences in toxicity between species, let alone between all the other species and human beings. So we need to move away. And most chemicals that are being used out in the market today have never been tested for safety. And part of the reason is because animal experimentation for toxicity testing is a long, laborious process. So we need, and there are much more efficient and faster methods that we could just really just continue to do all this large numbers of testing at a much faster rate if we moved away from animal testing, even sooner than the 2035 mandate. Now, the other reason where animals are used for, and they're required for regulatory reasons, is for food and drugs. You mentioned cosmetics, and yes, some countries are still being holdouts and requiring cosmetic testing on animals. China was one of the major ones, but they have made some recent changes, actually allowing for many cosmetics not to be tested on animals. Again, it's not a total 100% ban, but it's a step in the right direction. And I think cosmetic testing it's a great area to really show. When there was a real campaign by numerous animal protection organizations throughout the world, drawing attention to cosmetics and household products being experimented on animals. And that led to a lot of public outrage and, boycotting of many products. All those companies at the time just said, oh, we can't not use animals. You have to use animals for testing. And they fought. They really fought any kind of change. But look where we are. Not only can they change, they did, and we have even better methods that are more likely going to protect the consumer than the methods that involve the use of animals. So it really shows it, the old adage, where there's a will, there's a way. When there's a push, things happen, things do change. And so that can definitely happen in every other scientific use of animals as well. Pharma, and I'm sorry, this is such a long explanation, but if you bear with me, pharma will do whatever it takes to get their product out to market. So if the FDA is saying they want their product tested on animals, pharma will do it. That's what they'll do. If the FDA says we don't want animal testing, we want you to use these other methods based on human biology, then pharma will shift. So pharma, I don't think pharma has a vested interest as a whole in using animals. They do it because that's what FDA requires. And I think, we're starting to even see some pushback from some sectors in pharma against FDA requirements, against some of the animal testing. So, because I think they realize that it's an old requirement. It needs to die. Honestly, it's a requirement that was, it's now become just a knee-jerk requirement. It doesn't scientifically make sense. We've shown this again, and scientists have shown this again and again. The requirement by the FDA and other regulatory agencies to use animals doesn't scientifically make sense. We need to move away from animal testing, and they need to start, stop being so habitual. And that's really what it is. Having worked at the Food and Drug Administration, I will tell you this. A lot of their thinking is based on habit. They're comfortable with animal testing, so that's what they continue to use. But that's not how we need to govern the testing for the drugs and vaccines that are going into our bodies. It shouldn't be based on comfort. It should be based on what is the most effective type of research
Yeah, it's not very comfortable knowing about all these animals being put through this. That's a degree of comfort. And again, I think if there were more vegans in these places, then these changes might happen sooner. 2035 seems like a really long
Yeah.
way. When we think about some of these animals, who are the animals that we're talking about? What kind of numbers and where are they coming from, and who are these animals?
Yeah, as far as the numbers are concerned, it's really hard because almost there's very little transparency by about how the animals are used, how many animals are used, and which animals are used in certain countries, and definitely United States is one of the worst in regards to transparency. We know that in the US, majority of animals used are not protected even by the most dismal of welfare acts, the Animal Welfare Act, which barely provides any protection, if you even want to call that, even for the animals that are covered. But putting that aside, the majority of animals used in experimentation, more than 95%, are not even covered by the dismal Animal Welfare Act. So they're not counted. So we don't know how many animals are used in the US. There's estimates. It's estimated that at least 100 million animals, mice and estimated at least 100 million mice and rats are used in the United States each year. That does not include all the other animals that are used in experimentation. We know that there's about 700 of the animals that are covered under the Animal Welfare Act, and these are dogs, cats, non-human primates, um, uh, guinea pigs, rabbits, mammals, basically, except for mice and rats. They're about maybe the Animal Welfare Act count for 2018 was close to 800,000. So, it really, it changes depending on what country you're looking at, but we're talking about hundreds of millions at least each year globally.
And these are not happy situations for these animals at all. And so are they, do you know, are they bred into existence specifically for this purpose? And what happens to them after they're finished with them?
Yeah, it used to be that cats and dogs were taken from shelters, so-called shelters. They were given to labs for experimentation. And that led to a lot of outcry on the part of the public. So then that led then to kind of a hidden business practice, I guess, industry in a sense of breeding animals specifically for biomedical experimentation. So there are businesses, companies that breed monkeys, that breed beagles, that breed cats, that breed mice and rats, and so on for experimentation. And then there's still some importation of monkeys into the United States from places like Southeast Asia and Africa for experimentation as well.
So the Center for Contemporary Sciences has there's a brand new media announcing a new partnership with a group called Glasswall Syndicate. That sounds very exciting and might move things forward a little bit more quickly. What's that agreement about?
Sure, it's one of many agreements we hope to have as we move along. So really, we know that where the money goes is where the science will go. If the money is going towards animal testing will continue. If the money goes into developing superior methods that replace the use of animals, then that's where the science will go. And so what we're trying to do is, as an organization, we really want to try to change funding and investment. So one is we want to work with governmental agencies or work against them if we have to create some policy change if they're going to keep dragging their feet, to really push them to start prioritizing their funding into superior human-based testing methods, because they're currently not doing that. And then the other is to drive investment into these technologies. It's sort of like in the food space in some ways. So we've seen how greater investment in plant protein companies can really create much more opportunities and many more products, better products, and so on that more people use. We're doing something similar in the animal testing space, to help drive investment into those areas. And there's been some preliminary analysis that's been done that really shows that the market opportunity for animal testing over the next decade is really plateauing. And we hope to see a dip, that's really going to dip. And I expect we are going to see that dip. On the other hand, the market opportunities for these other types of testing methods that are based on human biology are on the rise. And so we want to help continue that rise and just keep driving investment into the companies and others who are really creating these great innovative testing methods that are so much more effective to help us understand the diseases that affect us and how to find the right treatments for them. And of course, they replace the use of animals, or they can at least potentially replace the use of animals.
And so, what kind of alternatives are we talking about? What's out there? And are you developing those specifically at the center?
So we as an organization do not develop them. Maybe one day if we can build a lab and I can, have our own scientific, lab with researchers developing alternatives. But right now we're pretty small. We are not developing them, but we're trying to help those who are. And that's really our goal, to help those who are and to help increase the number of people who are doing that, whether it's through working with academic institutions to train the next generation of biomedical scientists in these new techniques so that more and more of them are going into these types of testing methods as opposed to animal testing, driving funding and investment into the continuation of these testing methods, into improvement of these testing methods, because they can always be improved upon, to have more diversity of testing methods like this, and to actually get them into the hands of researchers. There are a lot of these methods out there that have been out there for decades, and they're not being used, which is just horrible when you think about it. There are methods, there are alternatives to using, the Draize test, in which you pour chemicals down a rabbit's eyes, or these skin toxicity tests on animals. There are alternatives out there, and they're not being used to the max, not being used anywhere near to the maximum that they should be used. So it's not only having these methods out there, but making sure they're being used. So that's really our goal, is to really help make bridges, to really get bridges between investors, funders, governmental agencies, scientists, academic institutions, companies that are developing these methods, and so on, to really change the system in a much more systemic way.
And are you working directly with the Canadian Centre for the Validation of Alternative Methods, Dr. Charu Chandrasekhara?
Charu is on our advisory council, and I love her. She's a wonderful person. So yeah, we do look for partnerships in any way we can. We haven't come up with a direct program yet to work with her on, but she has been helpful, tremendously helpful in a lot of the work that we've been doing.
And also, I spoke last year with the director at the Society for Humane Science in Vancouver. I don't know if you're familiar with them. And their focus is to get into the schools. So for the next generation of scientists, rather than dissecting a frog or a pig fetus or whatever that they're doing in the schools, is to try to just, start to rewire the brains of young scientists away from this idea that we need to use animals all the time. So are you familiar with them, and does that play a role in your outreach?
No, we haven't immediately. We haven't. Well, let me step back. I'm aware of them, but we haven't directly worked with them yet.
But that's the kind of relationships that you're building, is it?
That's one kind of relationship, but also, to also build relationships with those who are doing or funding animal experimentation to really help make some real changes, and those who are creating these new technologies. So we are trying to build relationships across a wide variety of sectors. I mean, there's no limit here on who we could potentially partner with.
That's awesome. And so, what she was talking about, things like organs on
Mhm.
chips, which, I'm not a scientist, I have a little bit of science in my background, but for those of us who are not scientists, what are these alternatives specifically a little bit? How do they work?
So organs on a chip is one testing method that's really came out about maybe 15 years ago, if I'm right. And 15 years ago, I think before that, we would never have dreamed that such a thing could occur. But it's a great new technology. It's getting a lot of enthusiasm. It's one of a lot of people now are jumping into this area. Even academic centers are creating their own versions of organs on a chip. Basically, what you're doing with an organ on a chip is that you're capturing human cells, and let's say you're creating a human lung on a chip. You have human lung cells, human tissues that are housed on this plastic device. It kind of, I think it looked like a computer chip initially. That's why it's called organs on a chip, because it's a small little plastic chip. And in this chip, these cells live. They're and what they do is that they recreate the structure and function as much as they possibly can at this point. That really recapitulates the entire human lung. And so on an organ, a human lung on a chip, for example, can actually breathe and function like a living human lung. And there's human liver on a chip, human gut on a chip, there's a mini brain on a chip, and heart on a chip, and so on. And there's actually even the human body on a chip, where so many of these organs are now connected. This is really exciting. They're by no means perfect, and they constantly need improvement on. They're constantly improving them to make them um, more accurate to the full living lung and so on. So there's always room for improvement, and that will happen as long as we put our funding and our investment in those areas. But the wonderful thing about these is, again, when we're looking at human biology, we're looking at human organs on a chip. And that's why so many people are so excited, because you can really get down and really study very closely how COVID-19, for example, affects lung tissues, which is and one of the things that's being done right now. One of the types of research that's being conducted, and really look at whether a vaccine is going to be safe and effective using these organs on a chip, for example. That's just one type of method. There's human organs actually that are being grown in the lab. They're being 3D printed. And these are miniature versions of organs. And who knows what the next step is, but these are just some of the technologies. There are other types of methods that have been around for a long time. There's computer modeling, computer analysis, which honestly we're not using them nearly to the maximum potential that they can be used. There's so much human data out there already that's not being used, to the max by any means, that we should be using them. Data about the efficacy and safety of drugs, for example, and other things. And so, there's a lot of efforts to really, what they call big data, to really mine all this data to really inform so many areas of research. So there's a lot of different methods available now. And then again, who knows what the next big thing is going to be? I'm sure there's going to be some brilliant scientist who's going to come up with something new that's going to really be revolutionary. And but again, this happens only if we are willing to put our resources and our effort into this.
Right. Well, thank you for what you're doing in that regard. Absolutely. And I want to shift gears a little bit and talk
Mhm.
about the COVID situation,
Mhm.
because you've spoken so eloquently about that. And I still hear people on the television news or different places saying, who would ever have guessed that this is where we would be? Well, apparently scientists were not really surprised that when this COVID happened. Can you speak about that?
Yeah, even I kind of guessed that this would happen. I had a TED talk in 2014 when I said the way we treat animals is going to cause the next big pandemic. And I don't even think this is the big pandemic. This is not the big one. the big one's still to happen, unfortunately. But yeah, there have been many scientists who've been, and saying, and scientists from the animal protection community as well, saying, listen, we're going to cause a pandemic. The way we treat animals is going to cause a pandemic. But we've been lone voices in the world, and the larger scientific community, our public health agencies, our governmental agencies, even the mainstream media did not give voice to these predictions and these concerns, and they still don't. So few people really understand how the pandemic originated or how we believe it originated. So many people, it's so frustrating to see so many people saying, oh, but some person in China ate a bat and that's why we have COVID-19. No, that's not it. It's a much larger issue. And we are culprits in this. I mean, and we know that exploitation of animals, we know is such a significant contributor to the rise of infectious diseases. And in fact, 3/4 of new infectious diseases are coming from other animals. And it's not their fault. It's because of how we're treating them. It's how we relate with other animals. That's what's stemming our rise in new infections and increasing our risk for new pandemics.
So there's currently circulating the idea that the virus has escaped from a lab, and that Dr. Robert Redfield, I believe, is a former CDC chief. And my understanding, when the virus first happened, I looked to Cuba. I visited Cuba a couple times, and I visited their their school of medicine, where they train doctors from all over the world, and for free, and send them back to their home countries to help underprivileged people where they come from. And so I know Cuba, the work that Cuba has done, sending doctors around the world into various emergency situations and Ebola and all the rest of it. So I went and looked, and what's Cuba doing? And what I learned way back then was that there was a doctor talking about how they had been looking at the COVID virus since, I think he said, the 80s. And I thought, what's that about? Why are you looking at the COVID virus? But apparently this is what happens, is that viruses are taken into labs and examined. So can you tell us about, what do you think about this suggestion that it was something that escaped from a lab? And how does that relate to the idea that it's a zoonotic disease?
So, yeah, there's coronaviruses. So, have, been studied, have in the laboratory for quite a long time. SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, which caused a lot of devastation in Southeast Asia. That was a coronavirus, and that's still circulating out there. As far as, so yes, researchers will bring in a lot of the infections into the lab. They're trying to understand it. I mean, they're trying to understand so many of these infections, because the more we know about them, the more we can better prepare for, if something like the pandemic happens. And so, I understand why this happens, why researchers bring these viruses into the lab. The problem is that in this case, we're talking about a particular lab that I think they captured bats in China and brought them into the lab, and they were studying the virus in them. So you get back to the use of animals for experimentation, which is something obviously I'm not happy about in the first place. But as far as the theory that the virus may have escaped from a lab, who knows? It's a very possible scenario. In the United States, the only time we ever had Ebola in the United States was when we shipped monkeys who were infected with Ebola into the United States for laboratory experimentation. And so, animals can carry a variety of different viruses that could get out. And at this time, so the company, which is now called Covance, they were called Hazelton Labs at the time, they shipped Ebola-infected monkeys on multiple occasions into the United States. And of course, as much as possible, so much of that gets hushed because it's not good PR. And the government, unfortunately, also protects these companies and these institutions. So there's a lot of viruses, a lot of infectious diseases that are being studied in laboratories. And yes, there's always a potential for them to escape. They could infect a person who's working in the lab, and then that person can take it out into the larger community. It just depends. A lot of it depends on how rigorous the safety protocols are in the laboratory where these animals are being used. So I can't say other than to say that it's a very possible scenario that this virus could have escaped from a lab. Another equally possible scenario is that it really did stem from originate, at least in humans, from the live markets in China. And that's because we've seen other viruses come out from live markets in China. Now, I do want to say that the live markets in China is just one small part of a much larger wildlife trade. So, when we think about pandemics and how they could originate, we have to go far beyond just looking at these live markets in China. It's the entire trade of animals. It's the entire way we treat animals and exploit them, whether it's for food, whether it's as medicinal objects, whether they're being shipped around the globe to use for experimentation, for their fur, for their skins, for entertainment, to stock zoos and circuses and other types of venues like that. It's the entire wildlife trade, and for pets, right? We have a huge exotic pet industry in the United States. So it's the entire wildlife trade that's a real culprit in our risk for infectious diseases.
So if we were to just leave these animals alone, I mean, they have these viruses are circulating within the animal population, but it's not until we come in direct contact with them and not just, walking on the same path as them in the forest. When we actually cut them up and they're bleeding, and that's when these viruses escape. Is that right?
Well, so it depends on the virus itself, but the closer your contact is with the animal, the greater chance of what's called spillover, meaning a virus to spill over from that species into the human population. So yeah, when you're up and close with an animal, when you're butchering them, when you're breathing, if it's an airborne virus, when you're up and close and you're breathing the same air as these animals, then yeah, the risk increases. Um, it the more we bring humans and other animals together. So, for most viruses, what we suspect is that there are thousands of viruses circulating that we've never heard of. We don't know anything about them, right? Because what we know is very little compared to what we don't know. And there's so many viruses that are carried by a variety of different species. I mean, fruit bats carry a lot of viruses, but these viruses don't cause harm. Most of these viruses don't cause harm to the fruit bats. They're just carriers. And it's no problem for humans until and unless we get into close contact with fruit bats, whether it's through habitat destruction that brings bats and humans into closer interaction, or whether it's through the wildlife trade in which these bats are caught and they're actually shipped and used as food and other things. So all of these factors, anything that brings us closer together with other species does definitely increase our risk.
Right. It's interesting that we don't we didn't learn a lot. It seems like from the 1918, which was an avian flu pandemic, right? That's known as the Spanish flu. But I heard that actually resulted in a farm in the United States. Is that right?
No, we don't know. The avian flu, we don't know exactly how it originated, but we do know that sort of coinciding. This was actually an influenza virus, and coinciding with the virus spreading in humans, they started to see it in pig populations as well. Now, whether it originated in pigs or we spread it to pigs, we don't know. But what we do know is there are multiple descendants of that virus circulating in pigs in factory farms throughout the world. And we do know that factory farms is also another major, huge risk for pandemics, because influenza viruses, which doesn't sound very scary, but we're not talking about the ones you get the seasonal vaccine for. We're talking about one that can really cause a pandemic. there's lots of mutations happening in the influenza virus because of factory farming, because these viruses can spread so easily from one animal to another in factory farms. So these viruses are mutating at a rate that we've never seen before.
Hmm. And that's why the concern from scientists, that's why you weren't surprised at this one and then what the next one might be. I've heard others like Dr. Greger also warning us that the next pandemic is just around the corner unless we rapidly change the way we live on this planet. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of the frustrating things. This was a chance with this pandemic to really call globally the call to attention, our relationships with animals and how we need to be moving forward. But that hasn't happened, of course. There's been pockets of it, and it's coming mostly from the animal protection community. So it's that message is being marginalized, it's being dismissed, it's being ignored. And so again, most people don't have any real understanding of how important this risk of infectious diseases for us and how they are stemming from our exploitation of other animals and our habitat destruction and so many other factors. And our media, they're not, they just are not interested for the most part. They're not interested in talking about how this pandemic originated or how the next one may originate. And so we're dropping the ball again. We're going to go back to our routines after this pandemic is over, and we're going to go and say, oh, people are going to say, oh, pandemic's no big deal. We have another pandemic. We'll get a vaccine real quick. And we were just lucky this time. We were incredibly lucky this time. But obviously, don't cross your fingers for next time to be so lucky, for us to be as lucky next time. And we have to remember, millions of people died during this vaccine. Millions of people suffered during this vaccine. So during this pandemic. So they were not so lucky. And the families of those people who died and suffered were not so lucky either. So we have to take these pandemics seriously. And the only way we're going to take them seriously if we address the root causes.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important that people take a moment to remember that millions of animals suffered and died in order for the vaccine to be produced. They celebrate getting the vaccine, but there's a real disconnect there as well, that this came at a cost to a lot of lives of individuals, right?
Yeah, it's the nature of us, right? We cause this virus because of our exploitation of animals. And so then to heal ourselves, we further exploit animals in laboratories, right? I will say that we don't need to be testing on animals for vaccines. And because animals were used in the process does not mean that they were necessary for the process. They were used because that's still the knee-jerk reaction everywhere. That's the regulatory reaction. No, we got to test on animals. What's really interesting is that this time, to get these vaccines out at such an unprecedented rate, to develop these vaccines, many regulatory agencies throughout the world, and the US is one of them, really allowed pharmaceutical companies to not do the usual preclinical animal testing that they normally would have to do for a vaccine. So instead, what happened is a lot of that normal animal testing didn't happen before human trials. It happened at the same time as human trials. So then it really begs the question, why bother doing them in the first place? I mean, the gold standard for human biology is human biology. When you're at the stage where you're testing these already on humans, why are you doing animal tests in the first place? So that really shows that they're just so cultured. This idea of you have to use animals is just, again, it's just such a knee-jerk reaction that they couldn't even get away, even though logically it doesn't make sense, even in this case, right? If you're already at human studies, why are you doing animal testing? But regulatory agencies just still couldn't get away from animal testing fully, so they still required it. But I think that what this also shows is that we really need the best testing methods possible. We need the most effective and most reliable, the most predictive testing methods possible. So I think, unfortunately, for the near term, the vaccine development led to an uptick in the use of animals in some areas. But long term, I think it's really going to highlight that animal testing is just not really where we need to go, and that it's going to lead to an increase in these other types of testing methods that can be far superior.
Hmm. I would like to suggest that we look to independent media sources. Certainly, you've been interviewed on a lot of different platforms, and there are those of us, we are trying to get the message out. So if people can support independent media, we're the ones doing the investigative journalism. It's
Yeah.
like, so we're gonna wrap up. I want to focus on your book a little bit, and also I think, are you featured in this new documentary, The End of Medicine, or do you know something about it?
Yeah, so yes, I am part of it. I help provide some scientific consultation to the movie as well. The film, we don't know where it's coming out yet now. It was slated to come out this spring and then it got delayed. But basically, it's the only real documentary, full-length documentary that I know of that's really looking at the root cause of this pandemic, how it happened, and how our exploitation of animals is a driving factor.
Okay. And your book, Symphony with Animals, sounds like a wonderful title. And what inspired you to write this book, and what should we know about it?
So the book, I'm always thinking of what new way can I, get people to think about our relationships with animals, to think about how we treat animals. So the book really, I will say this, the book, more than anything else, my goal for the book was to reach those people who love their cats and dogs, but never thought about other animals, right? Who don't think about the animals they may eat, the animals used in experimentation, the animals used for fur, and so on. So the book is narrative mostly, so it's framed in a narrative way. So it's through storytelling, with woven with the science and information woven into that. So it takes the reader on a journey. So it starts off with kind of softer issues in a sense, to introduce people to PTSD and veterans with PTSD and animals and domestic violence, and how the victims of domestic violence have been so um, protected by their animals, and they increase resiliency because of their animals. So stories like that, into ultimately addressing some of the harder issues about our violence against animals and exploitation of animals. And it's really to showcase how we treat animals, whether good or bad, really affects our well-being as well. So I'm hoping, if that might be a different approach, that is a different approach to bring people into this larger issue.
That's wonderful. And where can people find the book?
You can find it pretty much anywhere books are sold. It's on Amazon. I have to tell you, I'm not a fan of Amazon, but it's on Amazon. You can get it at Target, you can get it at Walmart, you can get it at independent bookstores. And just last week, it came out in paperback version as well.
Cool. I know that we have a local independent bookstore still. We have a couple of them, and you can always phone those independent bookstores and they'll order it, I think, too, right? So that's
Yes.
a nice way to support, keep those bookstores going. Thank you so much, Aisha. Is there anything else that you want to say before we go?
No, I had a wonderful time talking with you, Janine.
Me too. Thank you. And for all your work. You give me hope for the future.
Thank you so much.